It is time to get going here. I just wanted to give a quick welcome message. I'm Mayor Frank Rossi Jr., and it's great to see such a good turnout here tonight. Obviously, we are very, very concerned about the future of the village. All of us that are in here that started with the comprehensive plan, and thanks again to their comprehensive plan committee for their hard work. And now moving on to this phase of the zoning, this is basically that next step of making sure that the future is bright and in control and just handled in a way that's going to be the best possible way for our village's future. Because there are a lot of municipalities throughout this state that don't have as much hope and ability to move forward the way our great village of Ballston Spa does. So thank you to our Zach. It's been a great opportunity to watch them at work, and they will continue probably into the early next year. But this is a very important night for you to help inform them on topics they need to hear more about throughout this these next months, I should say. So without further ado, Matt, I believe, or Chris, who's next up? Chris Crucial from Fisher Associates is our consultant, and he will take over from here. Everybody have a great night and have a little bit of fun with this, because there's going to be some great components throughout this next hour, 2 hours that we are here. Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me okay in the back? It's okay? All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for having me. I will say this seems like the most energetic group I've seen for a zoning forum, so that's really great. So the way tonight's going to work, I'm going to give a little bit of a presentation. Doesn't seem to be advancing though. There we go. Okay. So I'll give a presentation for the first part. So it's essentially me kind of giving you some info, talking about what the project is, a little bit about what zoning is, some of the analysis we've been doing. And then really the heart of this is the second part of the night, which is you all providing information to us. So we have some different boards, calling them stations, by some different topics, where you can provide your input on those. If you have any other thoughts, questions, etc., you can provide those as well. We're here to listen. We have the zoning advisory committee will be at each of the stations helping to facilitate, to take your comments. I'll be milling about, others will be as well. So we'll have opportunities for small one-on-one types of conversations after this presentation. All right, so what's the overall goal? As you probably know, since you're here, it's to develop an updated zoning code. And this one that better aligns with your comprehensive plan, which was fairly recently adopted, as well as addresses existing issues that are in your zoning code, and really just tries to bring it up to date to a best practices code, which right now your zoning code is decades old. So it's really due for a bit of a makeover. So I'm not going to read this. I will just note all these slides will be available on the village's website after this, so you can come back to this if you are interested. But this is several paragraphs that come directly from your comprehensive plan that articulates what your vision is looking forward into the future. And I highlighted a few phrases that are relevant to how the zoning code interacts with the comprehensive plan. Things like preserving the charm of your community, providing opportunities for economic growth, having that quaint and cozy character that this village is known for, and I presume you all love about the village, as well as other goals like how do you remain and impact affordable housing for your community moving into the future. Zoning touches on a lot of these. It doesn't necessarily, it's not the only solution. So it works with other goals within your comprehensive plan. So you start from the vision of your comprehensive plan. Then your plan has a number of issues that it breaks out. Things like focusing on your downtown, the historic preservation, community character, and other goals. And then that funnels down into these different recommendations. So as I mentioned, some recommendations relate to zoning. Some are other aspects and other initiatives and plans and projects that the community can undertake. So where we are today, we started this project around the beginning of the new year, and we had the zoning advisory committee, and maybe ZAC members, just raise your hands if you're a member of the ZAC, so you can kind of see where they are. So we have this well-represented group. And they basically, one of their first tasks was really just doing a deep dive of your existing zoning code. And they really read through this very dense document line by line, and really so really could understand what is in there and what's missing and what some of the issues are. And then we worked together and we developed sort of a general framework and a roadmap for how we're going to update the code. What we then did was start working on the code itself, taking that general framework, putting it together as a template, and started filling in a lot of what I'm calling the administrative aspects of the code, things that focus on the process. And now tonight, we're here, as was noted, to get your input. We'll take this input that we hear tonight, we'll synthesize that over the next couple of months, and then we'll start developing what I think is sort of the guts of the zoning code, which is essentially everything else that's going into the code within your neighborhoods, within your districts. How can they develop? What are the characteristics of that development? We will come back to present all of those draft documents again to the community, to have another round so that you can actually see how your input has filtered into the code itself. Take some more comments, we'll refine it, and then we'll ultimately looking for adoption somewhere hopefully in April. So talk a little bit about zoning for a minute, maybe again, just by a show of hands, how many people in here feel like you really understand what zoning is very well? Okay. A little bit, okay. That's actually probably better than a lot of these meetings. So some of you have some understanding, some of you seems like have a little bit less. I'm just going to give a couple of minutes of really what zoning is at a very high level. And really at the crux of it, it's the regulations. It's essentially, these are your laws that set the rules and the expectations for the development or redevelopment of properties within the community. The village has these different districts that you're divided into. Each district has its own characteristics. What uses are allowed, what are the different heights, how far back buildings need to be set, how much parking is required, and other types of regulations that are found in the code. It's also important to note what zoning does not do. So zoning can't force somebody to redevelop their property. You can't also, it also cannot dictate that a certain use or something occurs in a certain property. So for example, in your downtown, you can allow for a restaurant. You can even say a preference of what kind of restaurant you want, but you can't force that restaurant to go there. There are other initiatives that can help incentivize those things, but really zoning is setting the framework for what can be done. It dates back from the historical point of view about regulating land use for the benefit of public health, safety, and welfare. And it's really sort of morphed, I'd say, over the decades, but that's really at the crux of what zoning was intended to do. It's supposed to be developed according or in conformance, relatively speaking, with your comprehensive plan. It doesn't mean that everything has to be perfectly lock and sync, but they should be kind of moving that same direction. It's going to be adopted by the village board. And your code, it consists of text, it consists of the zoning map, and increasingly what we see in best practice codes is now also including different types of graphics, diagrams to help explain the concepts of what that text is. So why are we doing this? As I mentioned, your code, it's decades old. You've just had your comprehensive plan, so it's an opportune time to now take a fresh look at your zoning code to see where we can make some changes. Your existing code, it's frankly fairly difficult to understand. It's written in sort of an obsolete, kind of lawyerly way, which isn't really what best practice codes that tend to be nowadays written more so that more people can understand them. There are many needs for variances, so that's where something isn't allowed, but maybe it's already there. And so how do we deal with that? And so that's one of the things we need to address. You have some large properties in town, in the village, that have potential for redevelopment, but don't actually have a mechanism today to allow for that redevelopment. So that's another issue. And so looking forward, traditional zoning codes and your zoning code today, it's sort of predicated it on this premise of a really focusing first and foremost on what are the uses within the community. And then there's a lot about the process as well, and then a little bit about what the actual development itself looks like. The best practices today sort of flips that around a little bit, and it puts more emphasis on what the development looks like itself, because that tends to be what most people care about. They care like, how big is this building, but what does it look like? Does it fit within the character of the neighborhood? We still care about uses. They're not going away, certainly. An example would be, you wouldn't allow a nightclub in one of your single family residential districts just because it looks like a house, right? You still care about uses, but we're putting a little bit less of that focus on the use. And here's a couple examples of why we think about that. So the top photos, those are both the uses townhome, but they're quite different developments, as you can see. The bottom, they're both multifamily buildings, but they're drastically different. And so that's why if you leave it at the level of just use, you're not necessarily going to get the outcome that you would want for your community. Another issue is that zoning codes have traditionally used what I call blunt instruments, to the extent that they do try to shape development. So we might talk about height, but the height of a 3-story building with a flat roof is quite different from the height of a 3-story building with a pitched roof, as one example. They've often used these measures to dictate density. So floor area ratio is one example, and without really going into the weeds of what it is, an FAR of 1 could be a single-story building that covers the entire lot, or it could be a 4-story building that covers a quarter of the lot. Those are very different buildings, and so density isn't a very good measure. Another thing that we sometimes see is called units per acre for homes. This building on the left is a 2-family. It has a unit per acre of 25 units per acre. The one on the right, which is a huge multifamily building, has a lower density, and it's because it's on a much larger lot. So again, these measures aren't the best way to shape the development. Instead, there are better ways, and that's what we're hoping to do as part of this code. So I think there's, in my mind, 3 main components to this future code. First is that it would be user-friendly. So it's written and with in a layman's language. It incorporates graphics, and it's has a logical organization to it. Second is it improves the process. So today there's a lot of things where it's just really kind of unclear. What is the pathway for development? Who approves what and when? And so that's a second important part of this. I'd say both of those first 2 parts, they mostly concern the people who are using this sort of on a day in and day out basis. So those are your planning board, your zoning board of appeals. That tends to be who really cares about that part of the code. I'm a professional planner, and I have no idea what the code of the town I live in looks like, because it's just hasn't been relevant to me. But what I've read everybody here does care about is, what do your neighborhoods actually look like? How do they develop? And that's sort of the third part of this. And that's, again, really what we're here tonight, is to make sure that whatever goes into this code reflects the vision of the community. At the end of this, it's not the Fisher Associates zoning code. This is the Ballston Spa zoning code. So we want to make sure we get it right, keeping in mind that there's probably not going to be perfect consensus, because some of these things, they're judgment calls, right? So we do the best we can, and ultimately it's up to the village board to adopt and make amendments as it sees fit. So I'm going to just briefly talk about a little bit of the analysis we've done. So in terms of how we develop this code, we get community input, such as what we're hearing tonight, as well as from what we hear from the Zoning Advisory Committee. We read the code itself and look for areas for improvement. And we also do this type of high-level mapping analysis to get some additional information. And so we look at things like, what are your existing conditions? What are your existing lots look like? You have a fairly small parcels for a lot of the community. It's fairly walkable because you're a fairly small village. And so all those things we want to make sure are reflected in the future zoning code. This is your existing zoning map. One of the things that strikes me here is most of the community, it's not only residential, which is pretty typical, but for most of it, it's one zoning district. That might be okay. But if you have different residential neighborhoods that have different characteristics or they want some different characteristics, we might want to have some separate residential districts to reflect that. Here we're looking at the age of your properties. And as you would expect, it just sort of reinforces what I think probably most people here know, that throughout the village, you have a lot of historic and old properties. And then we also look at some ways where the zoning does not accurately sort of reflect what's there today. And so we do what's called nonconformity analysis. So this is one looking at uses. And so you can see a lot of these sort of pinkish, different colors. Those are homes that are 2 families or 3 families that are kind of sprinkled with what today is just zoned for single family homes. And so as the boards kind of have to deal with these properties, there needs to be some mechanism to do so in a way that makes sense. It's also something that this community needs to consider. Are you okay with those? Do you want to see more conversions? Do you want to see fewer of them in the future? So those are the types of things that we want input on. We look at things like your frontage, so their minimum sizes, and all of those reds actually don't meet the minimum size of the width. And this is pretty typical of what happens is these historic communities had a zoning code that was developed during, let's say, the 60s or 70s or 80s. And they were sort of done in this almost arbitrary fashion of what they think the minimum lot sizes and minimum frontages should be, as well as other types of setbacks, et cetera. And it doesn't actually reflect what you see there today. And it's an opportunity to make that change back to what people actually like about their community. And so here's one, just another one kind of similar of looking at the minimum lot size. So it's the same idea. I know these are kind of washed out. They are brighter on my slides. So if you are interested, you can look at them again online later. All right, so now where are we going with next steps? So one of the first things we need to do is look at what are the future zoning districts that you're going to have. We had a starting point for this from your comprehensive plan, which has a land use vision map. Again, this is a vision of land use. It doesn't perfectly correlate to the zoning map, but is a starting point. And really one of the things that we tried to do here was say, you have all these neighborhoods, so let's organize the districts by neighborhood. And one of the things we'll want you all to kind of think about and to provide some information on is, are these districts, are the boundaries correct? Are there some of these sort of, I don't want to say proposed districts because this is only a first draft for feedback, but of this first draft, maybe there are too many districts. Maybe some of these neighborhoods are very similar that they can be combined, for example, things like that. That's the type of input that we're looking for you to start kind of think critically about. Are we missing districts? That's another example of something. So the other piece we want you all to start to do is to kind of think critically about what is in your neighborhood and what are the characteristics of what you like and what you want to ensure we see more of, or you want to ensure that we retain. So I think looking at these 2 pictures, I think sort of viscerally, everybody here knows these are very different types of developments. A traditional Main Street on one side versus a strip mall on the other. But thinking in, well, what really makes them so different? You know, it's partially where's the parking, for example, is one very kind of low-hanging fruit, but there's plenty of other things as well to think about. And so we can sort of tease out all of those things that people say they want and actually put them into the regulations. So these things, these characteristics that I mentioned, location of parking, where on the building is it sited? So often setbacks aren't set in the place that actually reflects the historic nature of the existing development. What are the heights that are appropriate for different parts of your community? How sort of massive should the building be, or at least how should it read? Because large buildings can be broken down visually in different manners. There's architectural components that can be incorporated. In downtowns, often we want to ensure that on the ground floor, there's a high percentage of windows. And so all those types of things, we want you to start thinking about and provide that input of what really is important. So that kind of brings me now to what is the second part, which is this open house style. So as I mentioned, there are different stations with some different topics to try and get at some of these questions from you all and get your responses. There will be people around to help you provide information. We have Post-it notes and sticky notes and things like that for you to write on them and put them directly on the boards. We can also talk to any of us individually to provide some additional thoughts. We're here to answer questions. And so that's really what we're doing here tonight. And thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people show up. So I'm looking forward to this next part of it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting in just a second. But for those of you that are watching, this is the only part that's Zooming. Everything else will be done live at the meeting. So thank you for joining us and have a good night.